It's recording. Just like that. Just leave it alone. Leave it alone.
¿Ya está grabando?
Good morning, everyone. We're just about ready to begin. We have a full day, and it has been an absolutely wonderful conference, and I think we're all actually prepared to get really treated on some new and interesting topics today. I think it's really a beautiful blend of the science, the culture, the religion, and the psychology and emotions behind brain death and everything that that carries. So I think that today we're going to have a very nice set of presentations that revolve around not just how things are done in the scientific world, but how it's done in various places. And also, as you'll see, we're going to have a symposium in the afternoon about epilepsy. So really it's going to be bridging an awful lot of topics in a very short period of time.
I'd like to pronounce Dr. Hesse to talk on altered states of consciousness, not only the neuroemotional part.
Good morning.
Good morning.
If you've started the presentation sometimes and you get there and you realize I needed another slide that I didn't prepare. So I'll describe this slide to you that I learned while I've been at this conference. I think of the population in terms of a bell curve. And at the very far right side of the little wedge is the discussion about brain death and disorders of consciousness, the topic of this conference, where people are desperate to keep their loved ones alive, and hence are pushing the science and religion to define death more precisely. On the very far left end is a group that is desperate to give up their life because of suffering, euthanasia, etc. And so if you want to put it in extreme terms, the far right is giving up on death and the far left is giving up on life. Well, there's a whole middle part of that bell curve that I'd like to address here, and under the terms of altered states of consciousness. And it's something that happens more frequently than we realize. And sometimes when we don't understand something, we are quick to say disorders of consciousness. So when Calixto invited me to talk, I thought, boy, this is going to be a little bit off the edge, because it's not going to be about disorders, but altered states.
You need to use a computer, sir.
Just the topics that I'm going to cover very briefly in each category. Research categories: conscious and unconscious, faiths and meditation, transcendent research, and meditation practice. So we'll talk about the research categories. There are basically two different categories of research on these altered states of consciousness. One is non-theistic meditation, and it's shown to have healing benefits. It's the principal researchers for some time. Of course, there are many researchers, but if you had to put some names to it, it would be Dr. Herb Benson of Harvard and Richard Davidson of the University of Wisconsin. The primary subjects of their research have been Tibetan Buddhist monks, and one of the main institutes is the Mind and Life Institute, and they have a conference on Mind and Life conference. And then there's a theistic practices. And this is a separate batch of research, and it has shown through Met's research that there are healing benefits to having a theistic faith belief, attending services weekly, and prayer. And the principal, can't say the researcher, but an editor of the Bible on all of the research is Dr. Harold Koenig from Duke University. And the primary subjects have been theistic interfaith believers. And one of the main institutes in this field is the Institute for Spirituality and Health, of which I'm a part in Houston. It's the oldest such organization in the country, and was the first to teach chaplains in the U.S. And the conferences are twofold. The Conference on Medicine and Religion and on European Conference on Religion, Spirituality, and Health. Now, what's interesting is about 200 years ago, there was a split between religion and medicine because medicine started to get so technical that religion was kind of discounted. And that has changed. And recently, the International Conference on Medicine and Religion is now sponsored by Harvard, University of Chicago, the Institute for Spirituality and Health. It has an annual conference which covers medical research on the benefits of healing, benefits of religion. The other conference is a European Conference on Religion, Spirituality, and Health, and it has multiple European universities. I've presented both. There is a little bit of cross-fertilization, so that's good. The concept behind this whole research is that there is a non-dualistic approach to the body and the soul and reason and faith and science and theology. And if there is a contradiction between our understandings of either one of these, then our understandings of one or both are wrong. Now, this means that the body and soul are meant for each other and that there should be interaction between healing benefits of faith and science. And I might point out that if a believer believes in reincarnation, that's really dualistic, which can lead to a justifiable, in their thinking, basis for sometimes killing the body because they're going to get another one. But that's not the philosophy that we're going to be proceeding on here. So there is a faith and science agreement that we're assuming here as we go forward. One is a quote from St. Pope John Paul II: "Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from false absolutes." And that is not unique, because Albert Einstein said that science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. So that is the basis under which we're proceeding here. Now, the Bible on the subject of pulling together all of the research is really the handbook of religion and health. It's a very thick volume, and basically Harold Koenig is the main editor out of Duke, and he pulled together all of the research that was done as of that time, and it's getting very difficult to do that because there's so much. But it does bring about the concept of, well, what is this theistic religions? What are they? Well, this is a breakdown of those, but the key point is actually the very bottom, and that is, of the world's population, about 87% of the world believes in God. So the non-religious here that you see does not necessarily mean they don't believe in God. And so this is the key right here. So what were the results of this research? Well, this was presented in the 2015 conference here, those results. And so I'm not going to go back and repeat all of them, but I can just in summary say that people that had this theistic approach lived up to 7 years longer of life expectancy. There was improved immunity, which meant there was lower interleukin-6 and lower cholesterol, lower blood pressure, less stress, less addiction, less pain, and less depression. And these were categories that were backed up by multiple studies. So Koenig basically said, we are going to, out of all these studies, 90% show this is the case, which strengthened the results. Now, what were those categories? The research results actually came out of 3 categories. Those people that believed in a God, those who had a regular church attendance, and those who prayed frequently. Now, you'll notice that most of these studies are about studying religion, not spirituality. And you may say, well, why is that? Well, you can quantify religion, but you can't quantify spirituality. So it's not to say that we're discounting spirituality, but you can't quantify it. Whereas with religion, you can say, well, I went to services once a week, or I prayed, etc., etc. Now, there are 2 types of prayer. One is discursive or cataphatic from the Greek, which means engaging the imagination in through thoughts and words. This is what most of us are familiar with. We think our prayers, on occasion we may speak them, but it's an engagement of the imagination, and almost everybody knows this regardless of their faith belief. The point here is that these prayer types for non-theistic faith believers is generally called meditation. Now, in this whole field, terminology gets very muddled, and I'll try to be specific about the terminology. The other is contemplative or apophatic, which is a concentrated intention, focused and wordless. This is what has been practiced in monasteries and convents for centuries, and is only recently been brought out in the public forum and offered to people because they thought that the general population wasn't ready for it. The most common term, which is synonymous with mystical prayer, is contemplative. So for the purpose of this presentation, mysticism and contemplation will be synonymous. Now, I can say that I personally learned this prayer practice in a monastery, and as a result, I've taught it to 1,000 people or more, which is what gets my interest in this, because I'm also a scientist. Now, one of the research programs that was done on discursive prayer was presented at the 2015 conference here with with fMRI evaluations and written evaluations of subjects who had depression, tendency to depression, and had traumatic memories but were not under medication. And the researcher at Baylor College of Medicine, who was Romero Salas, was here presenting, and it showed a definite correlation between a one hour a week for 6 weeks interaction with someone to try to get them to recall their trauma and forgive. And it was long lasting. A year later, it was still there. So this is discursive. But there has been contemplative research. The first really was by a neuroscientist, Dr. Newberg. He did scans on Franciscan nuns practicing centering prayer. And later this afternoon, I'll actually teach centering prayer. Centering prayer is really just a vestibule to contemplative prayer. So it basically allows us to open ourselves up for a gift of contemplative prayer. So they are related. Now, there is non-theistic meditation and research that was mainly done by Benson, is one of the first ones at Harvard. And not surprisingly, the same type of results came about. Brain neuroplasticity was demonstrated, as did Newberg. When Newberg first did that, it was on the early stages of neuroplasticity thinking, and he showed that the Franciscan nuns had their brains changed. And so there was lower blood pressure, less melancholy, less nervousness, less suffering, less anger, less sleep required. So this is non-theistic and still showing a healing process. Now, this may seem out of sequence, but if you just kind of keep these things in mind, I'll bring them together at the end. I'd like to speak about conscious and unconscious brain. Now, we know that the brain has dualism in many ways. I'm going to address just one dualistic, and this is not the same dualism I talked about earlier. This is the duality of the brain. And I'd like to talk about the conscious and the unconscious. Now, I don't want to preach to the converted. Everybody here knows more about this than perhaps I do, but obviously the conscious brain is slow, unconscious fast, systematic, automatic, explicit, implicit, analytic, heuristic, rule-based, intuitive, proactive, reactive, reflective, impulsive, neurocortex, limbic system. Youngest in the brain, the oldest in the brain is the unconscious. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, this relates to the prayer practice. And I'd like to give an example by talking about a man by the name of Michael May. Michael May, when he was about 2 months old, lost his sight due to an accident. And at the age in his 40s, science came to the point where they felt they could restore his eyesight, which is very unusual. And they did the operation, and when he was going to get his bandages removed, they called his 2 children in and his wife. They stood in front of him, so they were the first he would see. And he opened his eyes, and there he was. His conscious brain now was bombarded by data. And as we know, visual is a big part of the brain, so there's a lot of data. And they thought, this is wonderful. But they were studying this for a reason. And the reason they were studying it, because this was kind of unusual to be able to restore eyesight. Now, what's interesting is they thought everything's going to be fine. The problem is he couldn't remember his wife's face from one day to the next. He couldn't remember his children from one day to the next. He had trouble with differentiating between depth, the forest and the trees, and depth of field, and on and on and on. And you would think, well, then the surgery wasn't successful. Well, what happened was, and they concluded, was that the brain wires itself when we're children. And because the conscious brain can't handle all the data, it starts to store that data in the unconscious brain so that he doesn't have to think about it. So unconsciously, he might see a little mole on a face, and right away he knows it's his wife, or something like that. And so it's really the brain protecting itself and making itself more efficient by storing this stuff in the unconscious, so he can then process the data more efficiently in the conscious brain. Now, one consciousness test I thought was rather interesting, and that is, and this has been done, they put an electrical charge on a piece of cheese and let the rat eat it, and initially the rat bites in, gets a shock, backs off, and the rat then goes catatonic. It cannot deal with the conscious decision of, do I eat the cheese to live, or do I not eat the cheese to live? So that's one of the tests that has been used, but it's rather interesting because it shows that if the unconscious brain is being called upon to make these major decisions, they can't do it. It's got to be pushed into the conscious brain, and the rat doesn't have that. This brings us to a nice poem that I think captures this. A centipede was happy quite, until a frog in fun said, "Pray tell, which leg comes after which?" This raised her mind to such a pitch, she lay distracted in the ditch, not knowing how to run. So you're pushed to try to have consciousness, and if the animal doesn't have it, it's stuck. Now, what's in the unconscious? Well, obviously breathing, but also habits, both virtues and vices, worldviews, faith, God images, either loving or angry. By the way, the research that Koenig has shown is that if you believe in an angry God, you don't heal as well. So those images are in the unconscious. Traumas, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and also prejudices, isms. Now, the brain is actually protecting itself by pushing this stuff into the unconscious, but it doesn't mean that it's all good stuff, okay? And science was starting to recognize the role of consciousness. Max Planck, the Nobel Prize winner for quantum theory, said, "I regard consciousness as a fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness." This is a pretty profound jump in 1931. And then Roger Penrose, who was assistant to Stephen Hawking, said, "Consciousness seems to me to be such an important phenomenon that I simply cannot believe that it is something just accidentally conjured up by a complicated computation. It is the phenomenon whereby the universe's very existence is made known. One can argue that a universe governed by laws that do not allow consciousness is no universe at all." So science is starting, even the astrophysical scientists are starting to realize that the frontier of research is consciousness. You've probably heard of Eben Alexander. There was some debate about his treatment at the time, but he was a neurosurgeon and is a neurosurgeon, and he had a near-death experience, and he thought prior to that all consciousness was in the brain. After his near-death experience, he said, the brain itself doesn't produce consciousness. That is instead a kind of reducing valve, or filters sifting the larger non-physical consciousness that we possess in the non-physical world down into a more limited capacity for the duration of our mortal lives. In other words, there's consciousness outside the brain, and our brains can only perceive so much of it. And then one of my favorites, Father Teilhard de Chardin, the most telling and profound way of describing the evolution of the universe would undoubtedly be to trace the evolution of love. There is almost a sensual longing for communion with others who have a large vision, the immense fulfillment of the friendship between those engaged in furthering the evolution of consciousness as a quality impossible to describe. So, the subject is altered states of consciousness. Well, there are imposed altered states, drugs, electricity, trauma. We're not going to talk about those. There are natural states, sleep stages, near-death experiences, and what I've coined the term spiritual contemplative experiences. Now, we're going to focus on just the last two in red, okay? And this leads us into faiths and meditation. In terms of near-death experiences, I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, and who wrote about it first, Dr. Raymond Moody. I have absolutely no fear of death through my near-death research and my personal experiences. Death is, in my judgment, simply a transition into another kind of reality. So science was starting to realize that this wasn't just imposed by failure of the brain. There was something real going on, and science has come to believe that it is real, and believe it or not, based on children having near-death experiences and experiencing things that they would not otherwise know. That's when the science started to accept it as something real. Now, spiritual contemplative experiences have been written about over the centuries by Christians, by the way, other denominations too. So I'm Christian, I'm more familiar with this here, but in the first millennium, there were saints writing about their spiritual contemplative experiences. Second millennium, more experiences. And the third, in the modern, more people writing about their spiritual contemplative experiences. Now, a true spiritual contemplative experience that we're going to be discussing here is rather uncommon, perhaps less than 5%. But there's a bit of history to this, and for some reason, as scientists, we haven't picked up this literature and gone, holy cow here, what's going on? What were they doing? What were they experiencing? There are spiritual effects that are more common when you learn how to do sacred prayer, for example. And they're really the gifts of the Holy Spirit that religious Catholics and Christians would understand from Scripture. And I can say that from my experience of teaching it, most people will talk about peace. That's the main one, but others show up. And they don't show up during the prayer, the sacred prayer. They usually show up after the prayer. Whereas spiritual contemplative experiences, the real deep experiences, these come about 90% of the time, but the real deep spiritual contemplative experiences, they come in less than 5% of the time, and generally during the prayer itself. There are physical effects of these spiritual contemplative experiences, and again, it's the same list you've seen before. They're not surprising. Now, here's the interesting thing. You know about, I'm sure, confirmation bias. Part of our human condition is that because the brain is storing all these isms and all of these things in the unconscious, when the scientists did a test and they said, well, we're going to do an interview of people. We're going to ask them, well, what political party do you vote for, what religion, what economic strata, what race, et cetera, et cetera. And then they were, once they had that, they were given a set of multiple choice questions. And there were half the questions backed up their preconceived positions and half did not. And they were both solid research. And so they found that people will preferentially pick that research that supports their preconceived ideas. So human tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information of the unconscious in a way that confirms one's belief or hypotheses while giving disproportionate less attention to information that contradicts it. Now, is this bad? Is this evil? Well, the brain is protecting itself. What is our responsibility is to unload that unconscious and bring it to the conscious level. And that's why this prayer becomes very important. I've seen it happen. And in the unconscious unloading, you've got racism, sexism, religionism, nationalism, culturalism, economism. I made up some words here just to try to capture. The point is that having these in the unconscious doesn't necessarily make us an intrinsically evil person. It means that we have an obligation to address those, but we have to unload that unconscious into the conscious brain. Now, I could say that in that unloading process, centering prayer at its heart is taking a sacred word and using it as a mantra, and that's more of an Eastern religious term. But this was practiced in Catholic monasteries since the 4th century. And that word is a symbol of our desire to be with God. And then every time we become aware of our thoughts, become aware we're engaged with our thoughts, we ever so gently let go of those thoughts and return to our sacred word. What we're saying is we'd rather be with you, God, than even our own thoughts. That's the heart of centered prayer. Now you can see what's happening. You're basically making room in the conscious brain for the unconscious brain to unload, okay? And I've seen it happen when I teach the practice. These were observations that I had seen actually happen. One was PTSD, a man, I taught 10 people, 3 months later, I ran into him. I said, how's it going? And he said, well, something strange happened. I said, well, what happened? He said, during the prayer, I started to realize what really happened to me in Vietnam. I said, what did you do then? And he said, I ever so gently let it go and returned to God. I told this to the head of the psychiatric department of Baylor. His eyes popped out. In Houston, we have it's the largest medical center in the world by multiple times. And one of the hospitals is a VA hospital. And they have 2 floors of PTSD patients. And the head of the psychiatric department of Baylor works there too. He said, we cannot treat PTSD, we're struggling. And his eyes popped out. I've seen it happen with cancer, bipolar, incarceration, people being able to let go of the guilt, etc. And in one case, and as an example, I taught 10 people, and this was a few years ago, and I was not aware of their personal backgrounds, but they all 3 out of the 10 actually had near-death experiences in their previous life. After their first 20-minute practice, they were asked how did it go, and the 3 started to talk to each other with their eyes popping out, saying, well, we just relived our near-death experiences. This is stunning. I mean, I was a fly on the wall watching this. These are sincere people, educated, and they relived it. The unconscious unloaded that experience, which was 97, 95, 97% of the time. Near-death experiences are very pleasant. And that pleasant, very experience of the unconscious unloaded. So, this led to ask a few questions and to look into the transcendence of these 2 states. If you stop to think about it, the near-death experiences and the spiritual contemplative experiences are both transcendent states to the next life if you're a believer, if you're part of the 87%. Okay? So this has interest. And it's not that scientists are aware of this. The mystical, and again, contemplative, SCE attributes, our present consciousness is only one out of many worlds of consciousness that exist. Which worlds must contain experience which have a meaning for our life? And he gives it certain attributes which are very typical. And this is William James in his Varieties of Religious Experience in the early 1902. Einstein, the most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical. Gentlemen, this is real. And so what's the logical challenge here? We've got 87% of patients worldwide have theistic faith. Non-theistic meditation and theistic faith both heal. Why not study theistic meditation to double the healing? Now, I'm not saying we're actually at times two, but why not benefit from this? Basically, when we meet our patients, we have to meet them where they're at. And part of who they are is their faith. And yet, in that faith is a power to help heal. And that is why, and I'll quote Jesus here, because I'm a Christian, a Catholic. If you look at the 22 or so healings in the Scripture, Jesus was always healing both body and soul. They're linked. And so why shouldn't religion and medicine start coming together again, as Harvard and the major universities are realizing? So, what are the transcendent events? And what are the characteristics of these events? And these are currently being researched. Spiritual contemplative experiences. People will report that at the end of a 20-minute prayer, if it's a real spiritual contemplative experience, they will say, well, I've been only doing this for a few minutes. Well, it's been 20, 30 minutes. That's a surprise. They have a sense of wholeness or perfection as they experience. There's a sense of oneness in the universe, being given insight, and spacelessness, ecstasy, kind of out-of-body experience that quite often happens in the 5% category. Now, what's interesting, and this is what intrigued me when I experienced that with these 10 people, is if you look at near-death experiences, the attributes are basically the same. And if it's the transcendence to the next life, why shouldn't they be? Cognitive, I'll talk about cognitive, is timeless, affective, a certain sense of peace. Transcendent, they'll experience divine union or angels or something in their divine belief. And paranormal, out of body. So why shouldn't we study this and look at the comparison of these two experiences? So I said that, and then I'm here at the conference, and we taught centering prayer at the last conference, 2015, and one of the participants who's sitting here actually had a profound experience. And this happens quite often, more often I should say, to beginners. And it's an encouragement. In my view, it's God saying, come on. And this happened to this person that will be speaking later on SCE and NDE research. And then it dawned on me, here at Calixto, one of the world's experts at bringing people out of the unconscious states, says, I'm going, Calixto, have you had many people talk about near-death experiences? He said, all the time. And then I nearly jumped out of my skin. I said, and you mean to tell me you got brain scans on these people? And of course he said, well, I can't tell you that it was exactly when they had their near-death experiences. I said, well, just look for a pattern. So I'm getting excited. And so, and since, and I don't want to give this away too early, but when he, very personal relationship with a person that had this experience during the conference, then it clicked. And I proposed research to him that we look at the comparison of these two, because their attributes are very similar. Now, I'm going to tell you something next that doesn't relate to this research necessarily, but it's another intriguing piece of information. There is a third point of the transcendence between this world and the next. What is that? At the Big Bang, the singularity, it's timeless, it's outside time. And the reason is that all the light is trapped at that singularity. It's ordered. You notice the parallel between these? is ordered. In other words, the second law of thermodynamics said that entropy is a measure of the disorganization of the universe, and it's always increasing. Well, at the singularity, it was zero. It's unified. This is Einstein's unified theory. He's trying to get all of the forces unified in one equation. And it's dimensionless. At first, the singularity was thought to be the size of a baseball, then finally a golf ball, and now the size of a dot at the end of the sentence. Profound. So, how am I doing on time?
4 minutes.
Four minutes. Then I have 7. This is a presentation that Dr. Koenig, who I mentioned earlier, offered to give just for this conference. It's 7 minutes long. This is a meditative presentation. We don't have any words or sound. That's, you know,
These experiences are very, very common throughout the world. And many different faith traditions have different ways of inducing these altered states of consciousness where a person actually experiences God's presence and learns, perhaps in some cases, what God's will is for them. So meditation, many different forms of meditation and traditional prayer. Of course, there's the Buddhist meditation, which focuses on mindfulness, and this brings a person into very deep state of consciousness, as well as various forms of Hindu meditation, where there is a focus on a very specific word or phrase, such as Om. And there's the various forms of Muslim meditation, which can involve repeating the Quran, a verse of the Quran, and that can also bring on a state of deep peace and a sense of, of connection with God. Then there are many different forms of Christian meditation that are often not recognized, but certainly there is the Gregorian chant. They're very traditional within the church. There is what's called centering prayer, where a person focuses on God and tries to experience the presence of God. There's a marvelous little book called Closer Than a Brother by David Winter. And this book talks about this monk who lived in the 16th century, who spent his entire time in God's presence. And this gentleman had he worked in the kitchen, a kitchen of a hospital. And throughout his activities, he was able to maintain this constant presence with God, which gave him a great sense of peace and a great sense of centering, such that, he could do his work very efficiently, and it didn't drain him or anything, because he really felt that God was with him and was helping him. It's an extraordinary book, and it focuses on this centering prayer. So, meditation also within the Jewish tradition. There's the Kabbalah tradition within Judaism that focuses on meditation and have something, some kind of method for connecting with God through prayer, through meditation, through even focusing on various scriptures from the Bible, for example. The Psalms, or even Proverbs, but I think the Psalms are better scriptures to focus on. That they really do connect us with God. So this conference that is focusing, in part on various altered states of consciousness is very important and relevant to many different religious traditions, because this is the way that people establish a connection with God, which is what could be more important in life than to do that. I'd like to just...
I'm going to cut it off there in the interest of time. I will tell you that later this afternoon on the breakout session, I'll be teaching this form of prayer, but I'm going to do it in an interfaith way, so that regardless of your faith belief, it should be applicable to you.
Thank you very much.
We have time for one question? One question or comment? In the meantime, if Dr. Rosen would like to come up and share the slide deck.
When I met Dr. Hesse, we were talking a lot about near-death experiences